What if the White Rider never came back down that mountain? Middle-earth almost lost Gandalf twice. Once in Moria, falling into shadow and flame with a Balrog wrapped around him. And once more, quietly, in the days after, when whatever brought him back could easily have chosen not to. Tonight we sit inside that second possibility. Not the fall. The silence that would have followed it, if no one had sent him back. Gandalf's death in Moria is often treated as a certainty undone. He falls, and we know, somewhere in the back of our minds, that the story isn't finished with him yet. But strip that certainty away, and look at what his absence would actually mean for 8 travelers standing at the edge of Lothlorien, grieving a leader none of them know how to replace. The Fellowship without Gandalf isn't simply the Fellowship minus one member. It's a different shape entirely. Gandalf wasn't just wise. He was the only one among them who had seen enough ages of the world to know which fears were worth having and which weren't. Aragorn carries authority. Legolas carries skill. But only Gandalf carried certainty. The kind that comes from having already watched entire kingdoms rise and fall once before. Take that away at Moria, and the Fellowship that walks into Lothlorien is not grieving a friend. They are, whether they know it yet or not, already lost. Consider what happens next, practically. Aragorn becomes the default leader, not because anyone chooses him, but because there is no one else left with the standing to lead. And Aragorn, in this telling, is not yet the man who commands the paths of the dead, or unites Gondor and Rohan under one banner. He is still, in his own mind, the ranger who has spent decades hiding from his own bloodline. Tolkien gives us glimpses of how uncertain Aragorn feels about his own destiny, even with Gandalf beside him. Remove Gandalf, and that uncertainty doesn't shrink. It grows. At the exact moment the Fellowship needs its leader most sure of himself. Frodo would feel it hardest of all. Gandalf was the one voice that had never once treated the ring, or Frodo's fear of it, as small. Every reassurance Frodo receives on the road back to that voice, Gandalf's certainty that even the smallest person can change the course of the future. Without Gandalf, Frodo doesn't just lose a guide, he loses the one person who had already looked at his fear and found it reasonable, rather than something to be ashamed of. That absence changes the psychology of the entire quest. Frodo carries the ring, already convinced, deep down, that he is not enough for the task. Gandalf's presence was a quiet, constant argument against that belief. Take him away, and Frodo walks toward Mordor with one less reason to believe he can put the ring down when the moment finally comes. Now look east, to where the war is actually being fought. Saruman's betrayal becomes far more dangerous without Gandalf to counter it. In the story we know, Gandalf escapes Orthanc, rides to Rohan, and breaks Saruman's hold over Théoden with words alone. No army, no siege, just the return of one wizard who refuses to be intimidated by another. Without Gandalf, who challenges Saruman's voice in Théoden's hall? Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli arrive as strangers, asking a broken king to trust them. It is not hard to imagine that meeting ending very differently. Théoden remains bent under Wormtongue's counsel. Rohan does not ride to Gondor's aid, not because its people are cowards, but because no one with Gandalf's specific authority was there to break the spell holding their king in place. That single missing moment ripples outward across the entire war. The Battle of Helm's Deep, in our history, turns in Rohan's favor partly because Gandalf returns at dawn with reinforcements gathered through sheer force of will and old alliances. Remove him from that battlefield, and Helm's Deep becomes a siege with no relief. Théoden's people, already reduced to farmers and boys, hold as long as they can and then they don't. And the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the turning point of the entire war, loses the one figure who stands against the Witch King when Denethor's despair leaves Gondor's defense in ruins. Gandalf is the one who rides to Faramir's rescue, who confronts the Lord of the Nazgul directly at the gates of Minas Tirith, when no one else in the city dares. Without him, Denethor's madness goes unchecked. Faramir's retreat becomes a rout instead of an orderly withdrawal. And Minas Tirith, the last great city of men, falls not to overwhelming force, but to a collapse of leadership that only Gandalf's presence had been holding together. There is a version of this story where the White City burns, not because the war was unwinnable, but because the one person capable of steadying its defenders in the worst hour simply wasn't there to do it. What would the survivors carry in a world like that? Aragorn would carry the particular grief of a king crowned over ashes he could have prevented had he trusted himself sooner, without Gandalf there to lend him that trust second-hand. Frodo would carry his burden all the way to the fire, if he made it there at all, without the one person who had ever told him that hope, however small, was still worth carrying. And somewhere in that grief, there is a quieter question worth asking. What was it, exactly, that brought Gandalf back? Tolkien is careful never to make it purely a plot device. Gandalf himself, describing his return, speaks of it as something outside his own choosing. Sent back, he says, until his task is done. It is one of the few moments in the entire legendarium where something like grace intervenes directly in the story, not to reward strength, but simply because the task was unfinished and someone was needed to finish it. That detail matters more than it first appears. It means Gandalf's survival was never really about Gandalf's own power or cleverness in the fight against the Balrog. It was permission, granted from somewhere beyond the story itself, because Middle-earth still needed him. In a version where that permission is never granted, nothing about Gandalf's courage or skill changes. He fought exactly as hard both times. The only difference is whether the story allowed him to finish what he started. That's a strange kind of comfort, if you sit with it. It suggests that survival, in Tolkien's world, was never really the reward for being the strongest or the wisest in the room. Boromir was strong. Denethor was proud. Neither survived their worst hour. Gandalf came back not because he alone deserved it, but because the story he was part of still needed a light in it, and he had spent his whole existence making sure he was the kind of person worth sending back. Maybe that's the real answer to the question we started with. What if Gandalf never returned? Middle-earth would have found other candles to carry through that darkness. Aragorn would have grown into his crown more slowly and more painfully. Frodo would have carried his fear a little further alone. Some cities would have fallen that didn't. But the deeper truth Tolkien seems to be pointing toward is that the story was never resting on one figure alone, however much it might have felt that way in the moment. It was resting on every small act of courage that Gandalf's presence simply made a little easier to find. He came back so that no one else would have to be quite so alone in the dark. That, more than the staff or the sword or the fire of Anor, might be the truest thing about him. If this story moved you, there are more waiting. Quiet corners of Middle-earth that history remembers, but rarely feels. Subscribe and walk them with us.